and thank you for joining Part 4 of Sci-Farth's micro-webinar series, Workforce Realignment and Reductions in Force. This installment of the series will focus on using AI and technology in RIFs. All participants are in listen-only mode. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program through the Q&A section located on the right side of your WebEx window. Any unanswered questions will be followed up by email after the webinar. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down. It will not be repeated and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Barry Miller. Barry, you may begin.
Thanks, Brooke, and thank you to all of those of you in the audience for joining us for the fourth and final installment of our micro webinar series on workforce alignment and reductions in force. I'm Barry Miller. I'm an employment lawyer of about 20 years experience and have provided legal advice to employers over a couple of decades and a couple of economic cycles relating to making decisions in the context of a reduction in force, and then also in some instances, litigating the outcome of those reductions in force. With me is one of our senior associates, Molly Mooney, who is co-leading this initiative with me, and she'll be talking us through some of the legal aspects of the topic at hand while I address some of the more practical aspects of the situation along the way. The next slide is a real high-level overview of our agenda for today. We're going to talk about what artificial intelligence means in this context, because we are talking about something that's a little broader than what you may be thinking about in terms of ChatGPT, for example. We're going to cover what that technology may enable us to do, what use we can make of it. Then we'll talk about some of the trouble that we can get into using artificial intelligence to make employment-related decisions and layoff decisions in particular. And related to that, Molly's going to walk us through the state of the law and some of the new legislation that we see on the horizon that may further restrict employers' activities in this regard. So we can move right into the first section of our agenda, which is really just an introduction to the topic of artificial intelligence in the employment context. And we can move right into the first slide here, which talks about some parameters that we might use to understand what we mean by artificial intelligence. And as I've already said, we're not necessarily talking about the most cutting edge technology here. Algorithms of the sort you might even be able to program into a spreadsheet or something much less sophisticated have been used in the employment setting for many years, and really they implicate a lot of the same considerations as the more advanced technology, the difference being that the more advanced technology is quite a bit more powerful. And we see a lot of talk about the prospect of the use of artificial intelligence in the layoff context out there in the popular media. There's an article in Bloomberg's Daily Labor Report today that's on that topic specifically. And we see it in the popular media as well. One thing that we begin to see is lawsuits that address the use of artificial intelligence in the employment decision-making process. And those are still pretty rare. We saw a bunch of activity from the EEOC around a settlement that they entered into with a company called iTutor Group a few months ago. And they described it as the first significant settlement of a lawsuit involving artificial intelligence in the employment decision-making space. In fact, if you get beneath the surface of that settlement, you'll see that what iTutor Group was doing was in fact using an algorithm and technology that could have easily been 10, 15 years old. But it's a flag that the EEOC is planting in the ground around this issue and the potential use of this technology in ways that may implicate the employment discrimination laws in particular. But to talk a little bit more about the general state of play, we don't see among our clients a lot of direct use of very sophisticated things like ChatGPT or other generative AI to make layoff-related decisions yet. But we do see that on the horizon in a very clear way. We see employers beginning to use algorithms for other purposes, including performance evaluations and understanding what their employees are doing all day. We see a massive swell of data that organizations maintain about a wide variety of subjects, of course, but including their employees and their performance. And the proliferation of that data is what's going to enable employers to use more sophisticated technology to make decisions in the future. And we also see some commentary coming out of really business polling that some of these organizations in this space are doing. And one organization by a company called Capterra was very specific to this issue. They asked a bunch of HR folks if they planned to use advanced technologies in making employment-related decisions. And their survey data found that 98% of HR leaders said that they would use algorithms or software in some way to determine layoffs if they were to occur in this year, 2023. And a third of them said that they might essentially allow the software to make decisions for them. So that's kind of where we are. We're very much on the precipice of this issue with employers just beginning to experiment with these technologies and litigation foreseeable, but not yet producing opinions that are going to shape the law here. The next slide talks about various ways in which employers could use artificial intelligence in the layoff context, and we're already beginning to see at least the early stages of that. Can you pull the next slide up for us, Brooke? These are essentially a bunch of use cases for artificial intelligence in the reduction in force context. And one thing that we've seen in the popular media is the discussion of potentially using artificial intelligence in a broader way to drive business results. It's such that you're not necessarily asking a computer, how many people do we need to lay off? Or even which people do we need to lay off? You may be feeding some sort of software program a much broader base of data about your organization and using it to evaluate the efficacy or the profitability of business units and deciding when you need to conduct a layoff. And you may even be able to use that technology to shape the layoff in terms of the departments or other groups that are best going to serve the purposes of a layoff if one occurs. And of course, where most people's mind goes with this topic of artificial intelligence and layoffs is the notion of using some sort of software to select the particular individuals who will be terminated in a reduction in force, or potentially even to generate the criteria that the company will use to answer that question. There's been some discussion, and Molly and I had some fun asking ChatGPT what ChatGPT could do to help us with the layoff, and we got a bunch of interesting answers. And one of them that was particularly interesting was the notion of taking people who may not be making a real high-level contribution to an organization because of their skill set and identifying other ways in which they may be useful to an organization. That's obviously very cutting edge and innovative, and I suppose it should be viewed with some suspicion since it came from the software itself, but it's certainly something that stimulates thought about what you may be able to do in this space. The last bullet here we have is communication, and that's a use case that we already see with artificial intelligence all over the place. And that could be as simple as telling a generative AI program, draft me a termination notice, draft me a description of the layoff, and include these several factors. And we see among our own marketing groups and lots of other groups of people who generate that sort of content on a regular basis, that generative AI is certainly not going to replace those people, but it could make their efforts much, much more efficient. And one thing that you don't see on our use case list here is the notion that you may use AI to obviate human employees and the notion that AI might replace human workers. Of course, that's something that may happen in certain pockets of the economy, but to go back to the state of play that we're seeing in the market right now, unemployment is still at a historically low level. And for the most part, organizations are struggling to find more humans to work for them rather than finding ways to get rid of humans that work for them. One of our esteemed partners who has done a lot of work in artificial intelligence once said that people who are worried about artificial intelligence coming to take their job should actually be worried about some person who understands artificial intelligence coming to take their job. And I think that is very much the reality here. But in addition to these various sort of tricks that the software can do, my own sense is that using artificial intelligence in this way is going to change fundamentally the way that an organization approaches a layoff. Because those of you who have been through this process, particularly in larger organizations, know that it tends to involve a large amount of work that needs to be done in a short amount of time. And you're very often looking at a large group of people, and you have many factors that one could consider in deciding which ones to keep and which ones to separate. But the monumental size of the task limits the nimble nature of the work to be done. There's only so many analyses a human can do. And if you want to make little adjustments to the criteria or the departments affected or anything like that along the way, a human-driven approach is slow, it's cumbersome, and it's just fundamentally limited in a lot of ways. Using computers changes that in a material way. It opens up the types of data that might be considered in the layoff process, and Molly's going to talk more about that. It also just gives us that ability to refresh and permute results much more quickly and effectively than you could ever do with any sort of human-powered analysis. It allows for a lot of iteration and tweaking so that you can assess what the impact of a RIF will be, and you can adapt in real time to instructions that you may be getting from the operators of your business about what this RIF is going to look like. I think that takes us to the next slide, and Molly's going to talk to us about some of the upsides of the use of this technology for employment purposes.
Great. Thanks, Barry. So we can go to the next slide. So right off the bat, the biggest potential benefit of using AI for these types of decisions is its ability to analyze data in an inherently objective way. And that's beneficial at numerous junctures in the decision-making process throughout a reduction in force. So first, employers have to decide right off the bat what parts of the business are going to be impacted by the RIF. And AI can aid in that process due to its ability to ingest and analyze large quantities of data in an objective way. Now, typically, decision-making by humans is always going to have some level of subjectivity to it. When faced with decisions, we all take our prior experience, our personal preferences, and even emotion into that decision-making process, whether we mean to or not. And AI can provide a truly objective view of data to allow employers to analyze how best to streamline whatever it is that needs to be streamlined through the RIF process. So, for example, one possible use of AI in this context is to assess the productivity, not just of individual employees, but whole departments or groups within an organization to objectively choose which groups or departments will be impacted. But really, as Barry previewed, when we talk about using AI and RIFs, most of the focus is on using AI to decide which employees will be impacted. And that's because AI can process and analyze vast amounts of data very quickly, which could help ensure that RIF decisions are based on comprehensive information about each employee's performance, skill set, productivity, et cetera, essentially whatever data the employer is able to gather about employee performance. And ultimately, this can be really helpful because it opens the door to assessing employee performance based on more and more complex data for longer periods of time. Typically, decision makers are focused on short-term performance data when they're analyzing a RIF, maybe looking at the last few performance evaluations and recent feedback from a current manager, primarily because it is so time intensive to really digest the full picture of a longer term employee's performance. So if you're using AI for these types of decisions, you can really include any types of data that the employer has and wants to use for presumably the entire length of each employee's employment. So you could look at productivity, attendance, KPIs. You can even get into the really nitty-gritty metrics that some employers may track. So some companies monitor how much time employees spend on email, whether their camera is on, whether they're using company cell phones. All of that is employee data that is potentially available for use when evaluating these types of decisions. And we can go to the next slide. So turning to another potential benefit of using AI in the RIF context. So as we know and we just talked about, AI uses data and algorithms. And so it's less likely for there to be unconscious bias in AI decision making. Now, AI relies on quantifiable metrics and data to make its decisions. And so that necessarily results in decisions that are based on facts and data rather than subjective perceptions. Now, again, we talked about how AI analyzes data objectively, and that takes out personal emotions or feelings that can typically be a source of implicit bias when humans are the ones making those decisions. Now, AI can also apply the same objective criteria for selection across all employees, which would mean that decisions are being made uniformly for employees in similar roles or groups, which makes the decision making much more consistent across an entire organization. Finally, it's also potentially possible to program the algorithm or the AI to ensure that protected characteristics are not factors in the selection process. So for example, age, gender, religion, etc. And going a step further, it's potentially also possible to customize whatever AI model you're using to counteract any known bias. So for example, if the organization knows that for some reason there are specific roles or even groups within the company or organization that have traditionally been undervalued, perhaps there's a way to weight the analysis in those groups' favor. Now, ultimately, AI is using information and data that it's given. So there may be implicit bias in the performance data that it's fed. So if there's some implicit bias in performance evaluation ratings for specific employees, those types of things, AI is not going to be able to eliminate all bias, but it does make decisions based on the objective data that it's given. So we can go to the next slide. So just a few more things here. So we've talked about this. AI is efficient. It can analyze large sets of data very quickly, which eliminates a lot of the legwork for the employer in having to analyze performance and selection criteria. And that makes it a lot easier to use AI for larger scale reductions in force. So perhaps, nationwide, worldwide in scope, just the ability to digest that amount of data and ensure that the criteria are being applied uniformly, AI would be hugely helpful in that context. And Barry mentioned this in the beginning of the presentation. One interesting thing that AI can do is skill matching. So through the course of using it for the reduction in force decision-making process, it's analyzing large swaths of performance data for employees, which means that it has a lot of data about each individual employee and that employee's skill set. So it can then look at the employees that are impacted by the RIF and determine if there are any open positions or any other things that they can do within the organization based on their performance and their skill set that it just analyzed. And this could be really helpful on the back end of a RIF where employers are trying to determine if there are any roles that they can slot employees into. And ultimately, that would promote the retention of valuable talent within a company or organization. So finally, using AI could result in cost savings, not only from a time perspective in reducing the data analysis required by HR, but also by potentially using AI to generate the necessary RIF documents. So obviously everything will have to be reviewed by HR and legal, but AI can at least provide a starting point there. And I'm going to turn it over now to Barry to talk about some of the risk factors.
Thanks, Molly. So this is the portion of our agenda captioned, how do we get in trouble with this new toy that we have? And Molly's going to talk towards the end of the presentation about new laws that are going to make this trickier than it presently is. But existing law obviously prohibits discrimination in employment decisions, including terminations and layoffs. Nothing surprising about that. One reality of the situation is that using technology is no get out of jail free card as it relates to the existing discrimination laws. So if you execute a reduction in force and it has a disparate impact on any protected classification, whether it's race or age, which is often an issue in the layoff context, or gender or anything else, as a practical matter, the employer may be put in the position of justifying the actions that it's taken and proving that they weren't discriminatory, or if they had an inadvertent discriminatory impact, proving that what was done was job-related and consistent with business necessity, and potentially even that there was no less impactful way to execute the job actions without having an adverse impact on this group. None of that is new law. It's just a new practice that's going to be scrutinized under existing law. And as Molly's mentioned, there's two potential problems here. One is you may be operating with data that is already infected with bias that has accumulated over the years, and the technology may well not see past that data. It might even grab a hold of it and perpetuate the bias in the underlying data. That's essentially the legal problem that we worry about most with the use of artificial technology now. The computer made me do it is just not going to be a viable defense to some of the discrimination claims that arise in this context. And there's a few ways that an employer who is considering some of the things that we've talked about can do to insulate itself against this sort of liability. And one is an age-old trick. We've been doing this for many years with layoffs that are done the old-fashioned way, for lack of a better term. And it's a simple disparate impact analysis. We can do a statistical review of a layoff selection, whether a tentative one that's about to be implemented or even one that's already been implemented. And we can see statistically the impact on people in different age groups, which we usually break down into bands. And we can see the impact on people of different races and the respective genders. In fact, you could almost certainly program the AI to do all of that by itself if it were assisting with layoff selections. It's not super sophisticated, it's just a statistical exercise. One thing that folks should know about that is that the statistical review of a RIF is often not sufficient to identify what you might call intersectional bias. So because it's a statistical exercise, it relies on a body of candidates that's large enough to draw a statistical inference from. So you have to have a decisional unit in your RIF that's big enough to be susceptible to statistical analysis, and you have to have a lot of heterogeneity within that sample in order to assess the impact on any given group. And often with medium-sized or large groups, we can do that pretty effectively if we're looking at one criterion at a time. What is the impact on folks of a certain age? What is the impact of on folks of a certain race? But typically, you don't have enough data. You don't have enough sample size to assess, for example, what is the impact on Asian women over 40? So you're going to have some lingering exposure to those sorts of bias claims. And that's not a technology issue, it's a statistics issue. And it's one that the technology won't be able to solve for us on its own. But in addition to that old-fashioned approach that I just described, we're starting to see new entrants in the market that are essentially in the business of testing software for bias, particularly as we see the EEOC and certain state agencies really, ratchet up the scrutiny around this. There are companies out there that can help you vet your data for these potential biases, not just the data itself, but the operation of the software, and see if it tends to produce biased results. So certainly if you're thinking about using AI to make selection decisions, you're going to want to think about how you're going to vet those decisions as well. Which brings us to the next slide. In addition to the statistical issues that are raised here, all of the time and trouble that artificial intelligence stands to save us also puts us in a position of less information than we might otherwise have. Because if the machine is doing more of the work, there's less known to the people who are operating the machines. And algorithms are very often, even if we're talking about something much less sophisticated than generative AI, algorithms are oftentimes not particularly well understood by the people who are using them. And the more complex the algorithm is, the less it's going to tend to be understood by the people who are using it. And we see this in the generative AI space in a pointed way. The CEO of Google in April of this year came out in public and said that Google doesn't fully understand how its own generative AI works. And if you then think about an HR person trying to explain how generative AI worked in the context of a layoff, immediately you can see that there's going to be some issues there. In addition to just the technical sophistication of the software product itself, you're also going to have a little bit of a game of telephone, in my experience, where the people programming the technology are not going to be HR professionals, and the HR professionals who are using the technology are not going to be technocrats. And so that contributes to a lack of a comprehensive understanding of the technology by anybody who's involved. And I've seen this play out in real life, not in the layoff context, but I've handled other litigation in which an algorithm was used to set people's compensation on an ongoing basis. And there are two interesting trends that developed out of that. One is no one understood it. And so in response to a legal challenge, we could not find anyone in the organization who could actually explain what this software had done and why this person's compensation was what it was. In other words, you made things very difficult for your lawyers if you can't explain the reasons for your own actions. And over-reliance on technology definitely presents that possibility of a problem. The other is the humans may start to go to war with the technology. Particularly if they don't understand it, you will see people in your organization try to outsmart the algorithm and do things like manipulate performance reviews or other things like that to try to move around the model, which just contributes to the chaos of trying to explain what happened in any given situation. And all of that is further compounded by the last bullet here, which is if you're using software supplied by a third party, which most of you would be, all of these problems are going to be that much more difficult. You're going to have that much more opacity in your own employment-related decision-making and that much more difficulty explaining to someone what happened here. Next slide has just a few other thoughts at a real high level of things that you need to think about if you're using AI in this capacity. One is a point we've already discussed, which is layoffs tend to happen in a compressed time frame in a high-pressure situation. And doing this in a technologically supported way might actually require additional time to set up and think about what you're doing over and above a traditional RIF. You don't want to be trying to figure out the technology in the midst of making these selection decisions. You also have to think about data privacy, because another trend that we see is litigation that follows data breaches. So if you're aggregating all this data on people and on their activities and their performance, and then you subsequently have a data breach, you're going to have additional exposure that you've essentially created through this data aggregation process. You also have to make sure that the AI's priorities are your priorities, and that's going to be a similar exercise in terms of vetting the results and seeing the output of these algorithms and whether they're actually serving the business purposes of the organization or some other purpose that the software has divined. That's a tricky thing to vet. And particularly the first few times that you undertake to use technology like this, you want to build in some extra time to just assess what you've done. And the last bullet really just captures all of that. AI is not going to do your job for you. It is going to enable you to crunch a lot of data, but you need to make sure that you understand the process after it's played out. I'll read the CLE code before I turn it over to Molly for the last section of our presentation, and that code is SS, as in Seyfarth Shah, 4714. That's SS 4714. And with that, I'll turn it over to Molly.
Great, thank you. So we're going to now close out the presentation with what's probably the most important part of it, the legal considerations and legislation already in place governing the use of AI in the employment context. Now, I want to say as a disclaimer, this is meant to just be a general overview. We're running short on time, so to the extent you have specific questions about this, we'd be happy to connect you with whatever resources we can to answer those questions. As a starting point, various agencies of the federal government, including the EEOC, the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ, the CFPB, and the FTC, have all reiterated and made clear that all federal anti-discrimination laws apply to the use of automated systems in AI. So just because a decision is made by AI does not mean that that decision can violate Title VII. Next slide, please. Now, specifically, the EEOC in 2021 launched an agency-wide initiative to ensure that the use of software, including AI and other types of machine learning used in hiring and other employment decisions, comply with the federal civil rights laws. And the initiative's goal is to guide employers and employees to ensure that those technologies are used fairly and consistently. And in May of this year, the EEOC issued technical assistance on the use of AI in employment decisions. And so it clarified that it covers any sort of software or AI that's used to make what it calls selection decisions. So hiring, promotion, terminations, and again, makes clear that the use of the software cannot violate EEO laws. Now, the EEOC's expectation is that employers are going to assess whether a selection procedure has an adverse impact on a particular protected group. The technical assistance also makes clear that employers can be held liable for the tools created that it uses by third parties, so even software vendors. So essentially, employers can't just wash their hands of responsibility for the outcomes that flow from using tools developed by others. Now, overall, the technical assistance document doesn't impose any new rules on employers. It's just a reminder that the existing laws apply to these new and advanced technologies, including AI, and that employers are responsible for employment decisions that impact applicants and employees, whether those decisions are made by people or AI. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this was the first of what we expect to be many laws to come on this front. There are already some jurisdictions that have laws in place regarding the use of AI in the employment context. And the first is New York City. Again, this is New York City, not New York State. New York City Law 144 went into effect earlier this year, and it requires employers to conduct a bias audit and to notify employees of the use of AI before they can make an employment decision using AI. And the law uses the term automated employment decision tool, which is, it defines as a computer-based tool that uses machine learning, statistical modeling, data analytics, or artificial intelligence, and helps employers make employment decisions, and it substantially assists or replaces discretionary decision making. So that's what we've been talking about throughout the course of this webinar. Now, again, this law only applies to positions in New York City or remote positions reporting into New York City, but we're flagging it because, again, it's probably the first of more to come on this front. So we can go to the next slide. I want to highlight two additional laws. There is an act in Connecticut called an Act Concerning Artificial Intelligence, Automated Decision-Making, and Personal Data Privacy that was signed into law in June. And this law is actually really focused on Connecticut's own use of AI, but it has established an Office of Artificial Intelligence and a task force to study AI and to develop an AI Bill of Rights. So there's certainly more to come from Connecticut on that front. Similarly, Illinois has the Artificial Intelligence Video Interview Act that prohibits the use of AI to evaluate applicants who have not consented to the use of AI analysis. And now we'll go to the last slide, which it gives an overview of proposed legislation regarding the use of AI in the employment context. Now, we've highlighted two of these, given that these are just two New England states. So first, Massachusetts. There is a bill pending in Massachusetts that would be called an Act Preventing a Dystopian Work Environment, which is, of course, a very Massachusetts name for this act. But the act would require an employer to notify workers if it's planning to implement an automated decision system or any sort of electronic productivity system, and it would prohibit an employer from relying solely on the output from any sort of automated decision system to make a hiring, promotion, termination, or disciplinary decision. So there's certainly more to come from Massachusetts on that front. And there's also a bill pending in Rhode Island that would require any company using AI to ensure it's not used to engage in discrimination based on any protected characteristics. So the Rhode Island law is really sort of doubling down on the same type of guidance that we saw from the federal agencies. There's similar proposed legislation in a number of states. You can see we've listed a number of them up here on this slide. And the long and short of it is, technology is developing extraordinarily quickly in this space, and it's going to take the law a while to catch up, but we are absolutely seeing that start to happen. So keep your eye on these proposed bills. Sci-Farth will be tracking them and providing updates. To the extent you have any questions on that front, we would be happy to talk about it. Thank you all so much for participating today.